When it comes to self-development, no matter the method you use, the vital point is to practice. If you want to learn methods to transform your life and actively grow into the potential you know is inside of you, then you're in the right place. Welcome to The Vital Point. I'm your host, Jonathan Schecter. I'm a psychedelic integration and transformation coach and breathwork facilitator, as well as an enthusiast of personal growth. You have the capacity to evolve and bring your intentions and dreams into the world, and there's never been more access to so many incredible modalities that can help you on your journey. This podcast will help you learn about new methods to bring into your life, give you practices to follow, and share stories from practitioners who are doing the work so that you can feel inspired to go and practice, because that's the vital point. If you're enjoying the podcast, I'd really appreciate you leaving a review and subscribing on whatever platform you're listening to right now. This is still a new podcast, and I'm committed to growing so that more people can learn and feel inspired to go and try something that will literally change their life. Your help is really appreciated, so thank you for supporting the show. On this episode, I get into a great conversation with internal family systems therapist Justin Martin. Internal family systems, or IFS, is a powerful method for change, especially with deep parts of the shadow and areas of the personality that are challenging to integrate. As an IFS therapist, Justin was a great help in explaining what IFS is and how it works. We also discussed different parts of the self that can be challenging and the role that these parts have inside of us, how IFS can help men and the courage that it takes to open up and be vulnerable, the power of bringing curiosity into the process of transformational practice and therapy, and when it can be more important to feel than to think. So I hope you enjoyed this episode. My guest is Justin Martin. He's known as Parts of Me Therapy here on Instagram. And he is very cool internal family systems, aka parts work. Would you describe yourself as a therapist or a coach?
Oh, that's funny. I've been battling parts of me myself with that. Like, what do I call myself? Technically, I am a therapist in the state of Florida, but that's not just all of me. I think it's very easy for us therapists to get like, oh, this is my identity, and I'm just now kind of coming to grips that that's just a part of me. But that is when most people look me up, they're like, oh yeah, IFS therapist. So that's the technicalities behind my name. But yeah, good question.
I like that though. So I think what I'm hearing you say is that the labels that we put on each other and ourselves are just parts of us as well, and not necessarily like a defined concrete identity.
Right, exactly. Yeah, I would say that's the case. Yeah, because there are parts of me that are like, I don't know if I want to be a quote unquote therapist my whole life. I enjoy being a therapist, but there's some things about that label that aren't always fantastic, and so yeah, I ask me in a year what I'll call myself, and I might have a different answer. I don't know. Still something I'm internally working out.
I think there's a lot of wisdom in that, though. Just remembering that the label isn't, especially here on Instagram, right? Like, or social media, where people are sort of showing, to a certain extent, sometimes like the highlight reels of their life, or presenting things within a certain frame, and it's not necessarily like the reality, or what their life is like when they turn off their phone or their camera. So just that the reminder that the labels that we place on things aren't actual reality, independent of anything else.
Sure.
Yeah,
absolutely.
And you can still help people whether you have that label of being a therapist or a coach or whatever.
Right.
I think the intention is more important.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I've noticed too on the Instagram space, right? Like we could talk about what this word means in IFS, but there's a polarization sometimes between therapists and coaches, right? Like,
Hmm.
and I kind of see both sides to it. For me personally, it's just my opinion. Like, whether you have the like, it's important to have the training, right? But that being said, like, if you can help people, you can help people, and so
Hmm.
um, I, yeah, I have parts on both sides of that, right? Like, I get the battle between coaching and therapy and what fits for what and what doesn't fit for what. But you know, it's a nuanced discussion for sure. But I don't take the belief that only therapists can help people or that only coaches can help people, because I think that just takes me away from curiosity, right?
Hmm.
So, but yeah. Anyways, that's a discussion
Yeah, no,
for
that's a
another
that's
time.
a it's a cool way to get into the discussion. Yeah, so I came upon your account through the Ordinary Sacred, who's another
Okay. Yeah, that's
IFS
right.
practitioner here on Instagram,
Sure.
and you know I had her on a while ago and was like, I don't know how this is going to go for my audience. Like I think a
Mhm.
lot of people that are following my page are doing work with psychedelics, exploring the
Sure.
deeper end of breath work,
Sure.
into transformation. But within my circle of friends and sort of peers, we talk about IFS a lot and how it
Mhm.
comes up in the psychedelic space and how
Sure.
being able to use the parts framework to process and integrate some of our experiences, like how
Mhm.
that's been so helpful. And
Sure.
for me personally, like I work with a somatic experiencing practitioner that
Mhm.
um, has somehow like sort of folded IFS into how she helps me and how we
Sure.
process a lot of things. And that's how I kind of came to learn about IFS. And it's just been so helpful to me personally. And I always recommend it to people, especially like when they're kind of starting off on the path and trying to figure stuff out and everything's really
Yeah.
confused and overwhelming. And it's like, hey, this is like a really great place to start. And
Uh-huh.
then the episode that we did with Christine has been one of the most popular episodes when I look at, my analytics and I'm like, okay, we need more IFS discussion on the podcast. So I'm super happy
Yeah.
that you're here today.
Oh, me too. And I love Christine. Yeah, I'll have to go check out that episode you both did. She's great.
Yeah. So just to get into it, just in case, people aren't familiar with IFS, could you just kind of give us an overview of what that is?
Sure, sure. My kind of go-to spiel is like, are you the same person that you are at the grocery store that you are at a party, right? And
Hmm.
most people will say no. And if they say yes, I say, well, then I'd like to start going grocery shopping with you more. That normally gives someone the inclination that we have different parts of ourselves that show up in different settings, right? Um, and so uh, this idea, IFS has this idea that we all have different parts, right? None of them are inherently bad, right? They do certain roles for us. They get in certain functions for us, right? But what can end up happening is parts can take on extreme roles within our inner system, and that doesn't normally lead to good outcomes, right? And so there's this idea that we all have different parts, right? So I may say, like, I have an angry part of me, and I also have a lonely part of me. Those two things feel different, right? And so you can have multiple parts to you. When you say the word parts, sometimes people are like, oh, does this mean I'm crazy? No, like, there's actually a lot of stigma that the fact that we're divided. I think people think DID, and there's a lot of stigma around that too. But nothing inherently wrong with you that you have parts, and that's kind of the approach. So there's these parts, right? Um, and then real quick, like that, there's different types of parts. So just it doesn't really matter when you're kind of the client. I just call them protective parts, but if you want to get technical, there's managers and firefighter parts. manager parts are the parts of us that try and prevent pain proactively. So that might be something like, um, Justin, don't wear this shirt because people are going to not like it, or you might get made fun of, right? This part is trying to proactively stop me from wearing this shirt, right? The shame from the other people hasn't happened yet, but this part is concerned that it will happen, right? So that would be a manager part. A firefighter part is one that comes in reactively. And that's how they kind of get their name, is if you think of firefighters, they're jumping into the burning building and trying to douse the flames, right? It's
Right.
the building's already burning. So that's kind of how they got their name. And so that's reactive. So maybe an example of a firefighter part could be, um, something gets triggered in me and it's too overwhelming. And so then I just start drinking, right?
Mm-hmm.
So part of me that drinks, right? And that would be like a firefighter part. But it doesn't so much matter for our sake of like, do we classify what as what? They're just protective parts. They're trying to help calm the whatever's going on. And so then what's actually happening, like the parts that have a lot of emotion or belief systems that these parts are trying to protect against, are called exiles. And they're called that, again, for a reason, because they're kind of pushed down by a lot of these protective parts, by a lot of society too, right? And so these exiled parts often have a lot of feelings, beliefs, overwhelm, right? And they get triggered in the day-to-day life, and then that starts the protective parts to come in, right? And so really quick, like the common cycle I'll give is like, if you start to feel really lonely, right? One could say that's an exile. Then a firefighter jumps in and you start drinking, right? And then right after that, a critic jumps in and says, why are you drinking so much, Justin? You need to stop drinking. And so, and then that then just leads to me feeling lonelier, and the cycle just continues. And so you could look at that as like three different parts: the exile, firefighter, and manager, just all proactively in this cycle. Um, so there's all these different parts, right? And then there's also something that can help these parts, which is what we call an IFS self, which is just more of you, right? There's this place within all of us that has the ability to help these parts, help heal these exiles that are often driving these protective parts, and bring harmony to the inner system. And the good thing is that everybody has a self. It's undamaged, so there's no, it just needs, we just need help with some of these protective parts getting permission to kind of unblend a bit, step back, if you will, so that this can be there. And once this is there, we can kind of help heal the pain that's driving these protective parts. And that's pretty much the gist. In short, there's a bunch of nuances, but that's kind of the gist between all the different parts and then what we call self. And so, yeah, I hope that was helpful.
Yeah, for sure. Thank you for going into that and with such clarity. And I know as sort of a somebody that's interested in this stuff, but is definitely a novice, I would say, like thinking about those differences between the managers and the firefighter parts gets a little bit tricky, but it's something I'm learning to navigate within my own
Mm-hmm.
experience as well.
Sure.
I had something come up like last week around my partner that it was just really interesting to observe it, and it was based around like this feeling of jealousy. And as
Mm-hmm.
soon as I started feeling jealous, I immediately noticed that there was this critic that was saying like, this is not okay to feel this way, like you're
Yeah.
better than that, you've been
Right.
meditating for so long, or you do these
Right.
practices, like it's not okay, like just be better than that, like get over it you know
Sure.
and when we ended up talking about it, it was actually really challenging to actually share, these thoughts with her. And I had to,
Mm-hmm.
the only thing that helped was like actually prefacing it by saying, I feel really stupid for saying this. And there's a part of
Sure.
me that really doesn't feel okay
Yeah.
with feeling this way, like that I should
Yeah.
be better than that, you know?
Yeah.
But saying that and acknowledging that part and like letting it be there, not trying to change it, not being like, I'm just going to beat this out of you.
Right.
Like, I'm just going to, you know, that's what I would do in the past, right? Is just like, be like, nope, I'm going
Yeah.
to be better. And I'm just going to push this down and not talk about it.
Right.
And it's not safe. And nope, nope, nope. But it was like, hey, okay, this is what this part's feeling. This is not me, but a
Hmm.
part of me feels this way. And
Sure.
it's really challenging to actually share that.
Yeah. Yeah. No, I love that. That kind of goes to like a concept that I work with a lot of couples, which is just speaking for your parts, right? Instead of from them. So
Hmm.
like if if the jealousy fully takes over you, it's hard to speak for it because it's like it's fully here. You know, that may come out, I'm not saying just with you, but that may come out as like,
Yeah.
oh, why are you doing so and so, you know, XYZ, right? And then it's hard for your partner to hear you. But it's funny that you mentioned that because that is most people's experience. It's like if I can just get into this place where I can speak for what's going on, it's almost like these parts relax a bit, like like you're acknowledging that I'm here and you're not trying to change me. And that's more of that like self energy that we talked about. Um, and it normally, you know, then goes better for the other person to hear. And if not, at the very least, these parts feel like, okay, like you've got me, right? Even if the other person can't hear it, like you've acknowledged that I'm here. And, you know, that normally goes a lot better. But thank you for sharing. That's a great example. Yeah.
Yeah. And I also, I personally, like, I found so much value in building that relationship with the self that as
Mhm.
you know, referred to it, and being able to resource myself, or these different parts that are coming up in therapy or in different, you know, medicine experiences, with that higher, I call it the higher self, you know, because
Mhm.
that's sort of the way that I can resource myself with it.
Yeah.
But being able to, um, you know, I think that to me, like, that's been a huge difference between like cognitive, talk therapy and just sort of regular traditional therapies and somatic therapy and IFS is like, it's not just, well, we've got to fix something that's wrong. We've got to talk through it until we figure
Yeah.
out how to get through this. It's like, no, no, like there's actually resources that to help you accept all of
Yeah.
it. And like,
Hmm.
to me, like getting that has been such a game changer of like, no, it's not about like trying to fix something within me. It's like,
Right.
how can I love all these parts and like actually realize what their role is? Like, what, get curious. So like,
Mhm.
what is this protector actually trying to keep me safe from? And then
Right.
like getting to a place where I can say, thank you. Like, wow, you helped me get through something that was really, really challenging.
Hmm.
And I appreciate you. And just to let you know, we're not in that situation
Yeah.
anymore. Like, you don't have to
Yeah.
be driving the bus, so to speak.
Right. Right. Yeah. No, absolutely.
Such a paradigm shift, you know?
Right. Right. Yeah, it really is. And I think that um, I love what you said about getting curious because that's one of the I didn't mention this, but like there's 8 C's for the self. Um, you know, and don't quiz me if I get them all wrong, but calm, curious, courageous, connectedness, and a bunch of other ones off the top of my head.
Yeah.
But curiosity is one of the important foundational pieces where it's like, and you know, I love IFS, but if most therapy approaches that I really like have that as a core fundamental component about it, is getting curious about your own internal experience. And IFS isn't the only one to do that, but I love that it's in the framework with that. And um, you know, and then like you said, once I can get curious about what role this part is playing for me and actually understand its intent is to help me, even though that's not what's happening, I can have compassion for it. And that then, you know, is received differently from my inner system than me constantly wishing, or a part of me wishing that this wasn't going on, or I hate that this is there. Um, so yeah, it's a total paradigm shift.
Yeah. Is my experience of kind of, or the experience that I have with working with somebody that's combining like somatic experiencing with IFS, is that common, or what are other ways that like IFS is kind of explored?
I love that because it's like, this is also one of the reasons I gravitated towards IFS. I don't feel like I'm in a box because IFS, like most people that aren't even in IFS, can see things from a framework and do combine it with other modalities, right?
Yeah.
And so I'm not completely familiar with somatic experiencing, but there's like Susan McConnell is a great person within the IFS community that combines somatic work with IFS. And
Yeah.
I personally have done craniosacral therapy, which is a body-based kind of light massage, and the person I work with knows is IFS informed, and so we tie that in with it. So I think actually, that is a up and coming piece of IFS. It's like how can we use it with besides just traditional talking? Because for
Yeah.
some people and for some parts, they don't communicate with words in your head. They communicate with sensations.
Yeah.
Um, and IFS has a place for that. And so we can actually work with parts that don't communicate verbally, especially if trauma or stuff is pre-verbal,
Hmm.
right? My system shows up a lot like that, where it's not outward words, it's the sense I have. Like,
Hmm.
and so, um, but IFS has a way to work with that. It's not all the time is it talking. There's a talking component to it, but that's actually why I loved it, is I didn't feel so boxed in. And it's all about if I, as the therapist or practitioner, am really curious with my client, understanding that their system might show up differently than everyone else's system. And I have to
Hmm.
display the same curiosity that, these parts are actually asking for. And so sometimes it's a trial and error thing, where maybe we try and talk with this part, but it's not really responding. But I may ask, like, okay, like, and how are you reacting to that? Like, do you feel connected with this? Sometimes that's not with words. So to your point about how you can combine somatic experiencing with it, right? Like, um, yeah, I'm all for, getting curious about your own internal system and seeing what works, and sometimes that's the process. It's kind of like, throwing stuff at a wall and seeing what sticks. Um, I when I started IFS, I very much tried to do the talking thing, and it didn't work. And I collaborated with my therapist on that. And I was like, I'm starting to really get a sense that my parts I get a sense of them. And yeah, some people see them, some people hear them, some people just get a sense. It's really different for everybody.
Yeah.
But I
Yeah.
think the just to sum up, what I love about IFS is there's no specific protocol where it's like, oh, if you can't hear them, you're doing it wrong. That's not the case. Like everybody, we hold the place that everyone's system is unique, and we just have to work with it maybe a little differently than how we worked with a previous client. Like,
Hmm.
so.
I love that you said that, you're curious along with the client as well. That
Mhm.
you're there with them exploring these different C's.
Right,
Yeah. That's
right,
beautiful.
absolutely.
So one of the other C's that you mentioned is courageous, and I think
Mhm.
that that's something I'd like to touch on as well, because courage. I think oftentimes, like especially people that are starting off trying to figure themselves out and transform, they're they have like this goal of, or this idea that they're going to get to a place where they're not afraid,
Right,
and that's not what courage is. Courage is feeling the fear and being willing to sit with it and move forward anyway.
right.
Um, and I was just curious to, kind of talk with you about, you're a man, you practice IFS, we're both men, and just the value that this modality has for men in this healing space. Because
Yeah,
for myself, and I think a lot of other men that I've talked to, I think we have these parts that like tell us it's not okay to be vulnerable, or
Right.
to heal, to share these things with other people. And that
Uh-huh.
we have to man up. We have to,
Yeah.
and again, just to go back to what we were saying before, those parts of us have roles, and they were trying to keep us safe in maybe toxic environments, or environments where
Hmm.
it wouldn't necessarily be safe to be vulnerable and seen. But there's
Right.
so much value, I think, in this work for men.
Yes. Yes.
And how do you see that? Do you work with a lot of men with your client as clients, or?
I do work with some men, and there's another one where it's like, ask me in a year from now, because
Hmm.
I see just how needed it is, right? I've also recognized too, with the work that I've done, how much better I feel, right? And
Yeah.
so that might be something that I actually start to work more with. And I've had a lot of men reach out to me like, oh, I'm looking for someone to help me through this lens. So we'll see where that takes me in my career. But to your point, like courage, it's funny, like of all the qualities of self that we talked about, right? Compassion, calm, right? I I I almost think that courage is kind of our way in with men, because
Hmm.
in a lot of ways, I've noticed, this is, I'm not to say like all men, but you you almost kind of can speak when you can kind of speak directly to men, like in a courageous form. They almost can sometimes take that better than
Yeah.
like a more compassionate approach. And you can be both, right? In a lot of ways, if I speak to you courageously, I have a lot of compassion for you because I'm telling it kind of, straight to you, and respectfully, right? And so I think too, for men, if we can get in this place where we can have courage for ourselves and say like if us as men can lean into more courage, I think that that's going to be a good thing. And so it's funny when guys ask me what I do, I almost always try and use sports as an analogy because a lot of men can relate to that. And that's actually how I found IFS was um, I never understood how I could play football 1 minute and be so competitive. I mean, I have a very competitive part of me, and a lot of my buddies do too, right? And as soon as I step off that field, right, be a therapist the next minute, and it was just such a paradox for me. And then when I found IFS, I was like, oh my goodness, that makes so much sense, right? And so I will often, when men ask me what I do, if they play sports, I will say, like, are you the same person on the football field that you are at home? Um, and if they are, they normally have a lot of issues, just like I did, where they bring that competitiveness in, right? But most people can relate, like, yeah, when I tap into that, I'm just a different person, right? And so
Yeah.
um, the the selling point, I think, for men is what if you had more choice over that, where you could kind of. That's the other thing about IFS is sometimes it's like the healing component is great, but I think also the choice component of being in a relationship with what you feel so you can choose what you'd like to feel by being in a relationship with it is a huge benefit. And so um, you know, because I think for some of men's parts, if you try and sell it as you'll get to be more compassionate, right? That rubs up against their fears of like which a lot of us as men face of like we can't be vulnerable, we can't be compassionate. So you have to work with whatever protectors are there, right? And so yeah, I think this work is transformational with men. My hope is actually that more men start to embrace it and look at it, to not be afraid of their anger, to not be afraid of speaking and saying the hard things. And interestingly enough, I I I tend to side. I have bigger parts of me that are people pleasing more than um, like more than the opposite end of the spectrum, right? My parts are more like that, right? And so as I've leaned into more courage and been in connection with the people pleasing parts of me, I've noticed my relationships, although they may appear more rocky, get better when I can kind of say my truth and what's going on with me. Um,
Mm.
or,
Yes.
similar to the experience that you talked about, where there wasn't a real solution, but I'm just telling you where I'm at with these parts, right? And that can be hard for parts of us to do that, but the more stuff we have and more we can just speak for what's going on with us, I think it's transformational. So my hope is, again, we'll see if that's where my career takes me, but yeah, I think that this is a huge piece in Matt's work.
Yeah, there's so much juicy stuff in there to kind of unpack, like some of what I heard that was like really lit me up was the again going back to that curiosity, and you said, having more choice, having more freedom, and that's such a common experience of like when we get triggered, to take the IFS piece out of it, but like when we get triggered, we sort of are hijacked by that feeling. If we're talking about IFS, by that part sort of takes over, but having the curiosity and the choice to like, well, wait a minute, instead of getting hijacked by this, I'm going to like sit with it and look at it, be curious about it, go within. Um, within like holotropic breath work, they talk about taking it internally, taking it vertically rather than this
Yeah.
horizontal projection out onto the world.
Right.
And then being able to have the freedom from it, like you said.
Yeah.
Um, I love your analogy of the sports, and what came to mind was like, even like, okay, if I was to play quarterback versus being an offensive lineman or an assistant coach, would I be behaving the same way? Would I be wearing the same equipment? Would I be,
Yeah.
how would I have the same roles? Like, absolutely not. So I love that analogy. And then, the other thing that came up as you were speaking was that that courage is a part of our I don't know how I'd want to put it, maybe like the divine masculine, like the
Mhm.
true masculine energy. And that's not to say that women don't have that aspect of energy within
Yeah.
them, because we all have masculine and feminine energy. But I love what you said about like appealing to that divine masculine, and and really putting it in that frame of like, it's courageous for you to be here and to be seen and to take
Mhm.
a risk and to be doing this work.
Sure.
So I really appreciate that you shared that. Thank you.
Yeah. No, absolutely. I've been so curious too about like that's one way to frame things, masculine and feminine, right? And if both of us can have whatever you want to call those energies, whether it's masculine or feminine, but I have found that my relationships go so much better when I can weave in and out of both of those energies and be okay with communicating them in a way that feels true to me, and and then also getting the same from the other person. It's a beautiful thing, right?
Hmm.
Because I think um, for most of us, if we align with just this one energy and kind of exile the rest of us, it shows up in our lives. For men, especially if we exile our vulnerability, right? I was listening to a podcast, but I wrote a poem before I listened to the podcast, but this resonated with me, which is like you, something along the lines of uh, you can choose to be powerful or vulnerable, but you can't choose both. And
Hmm.
a lot of us men may gravitate towards power and feel just as alone. You know, so it it definitely is something that my hope is to get more out to men. Like, hey, I know it may not seem like it right now, but like if you're willing to step into this with my help, this actually may feel a little bit better to open up your heart, right? But that's a big ask for these protective parts, and so I don't discount the courage it takes to even start to do some of that work. So yeah.
Hmm. I think the irony there to me is that, in terms of choosing power versus vulnerability, that like when we're able to make that choice to be vulnerable, that actually increases our strength and,
Right.
sort of thusly our power. And like you were saying earlier, like the things that the parts that are afraid to be seen, when we actually like let them express, when we let them be there, things get easier rather than this internal
Yeah.
friction,
Right.
and fighting.
Yeah. Hmm. Absolutely. Yeah.
You had a post. I mean, I gotta say, like, tip of the cap to you on your content. You are a reals
Thanks.
master, and um, always really enjoy the stuff that you post. There was one thing in particular recently that I was like, oh yeah, this is good stuff, and it was about like the value of feeling, versus the need to think,
Yeah.
in healing, and how thinking can actually keep us stuck. And I think we started
Right.
to touch on that earlier, right? About like not needing to necessarily think about something or have that sort of um, recognition or cognition to actually heal something. And
Right.
like for me, that's just like such a juicy topic.
Yeah.
Like I think in the
Mhm.
beginning for myself, um, I really felt like when something challenging would come up, it was like stop the road, stop the show. We've got to fix this, and I got
Right.
to like get through it up here. And the
Right.
irony of like a lot of what's happening to us not even being up here, like
Right.
the what's happening in the head is actually keeping us stuck in some
Sure.
regard.
Yeah. Yeah. It's such a nuanced thing where it's like, some of my reels are like, oh, like you need to feel before you think kind of thing. But really the way I hold it is like thinking's not bad, but it can't be the whole pie. Like like the parts of me that are very logical are very helpful, right? And they unfortunately don't have the capacity to heal these exiles, right?
Mm.
And so they can help me and I can connect them to myself, right? And use them. I use them all the time. I need logic. Logic is very helpful, right? But most of us, especially us men, have built like those parts are so engraved in us that they almost feel like it's our identity. Um, and, one of the things that uh, we'll ask parts is like, what are you afraid would happen if you didn't do the job that you're doing? And
Mm.
so if you ask logic that, like, what are you afraid would happen if you didn't think your way through this, right? A lot of times there's like, well, I don't even know. That's all I've ever done is think, right? Like I don't even know another way, right? And you may ask, and what would that be like for you if you had no idea how this was going to go if you didn't think? And a lot of times there's anxiety there. There's like, I don't know. And then I can actually have a lot of compassion for logic working so hard to try and figure anything out because that's got to be an exhausting job. I have yet to meet a logical part that is doesn't at least at times wish that they can take a break, right? There are some that'll say, no, this is just what I do, which is fine too, right? But most of the time, people are seeing me because there's an issue with it, right? If all of them felt that way, they wouldn't even be in my office, right? If life was doing so well. so, yeah, I have a lot of compassion for logic, right? And logic won't be able to heal a lot of the pain that we have. It can be tremendously helpful in making sense of it, right? And sometimes what I'll do is like if logic comes up while I'm working with a client, I may even ask, like, is it possible that it can give some space and then come in afterwards and help us put this, you know, piece together, right? And that normally goes so well with logic because it's like, oh, you're acknowledging that I'm actually good at doing this, but like right now in this part of the session where like I'm not healing the pain, I may need to give you some space, but I can come in later and help you piece this all out, right? And so that's fine. And that's actually welcome, right? Like self would be okay with that, right? And so
Mm.
I don't think we actually have to exile logic. we just have to build a different relationship with it. So but yeah, some of my reels are like, it's because I relate. I have a big logical part. It's like, gosh, I have another polarized part. It's like, logic, would you give me a break? So both can be true, but
Yeah, I love that. I love what you said about changing the relationship with the different parts, and it's actually that was something that was kind of cropping up that I wanted to bring up as well as we kind of I want to be cognizant of the time as well. Um,
sure.
can you speak a little bit more about that, about like changing your relationship or the role of the parts? Because like for instance, for me, like I had this experience last year where I started to really become aware of how overbearing this inner critic part of me was, and like how much it
Mhm.
was dictating, different actions and the way that I looked at things. And I sat down with it and I was like, hey, like I want to do something different. And
Mhm.
it's like I almost gave myself permission for that part to sort of like take a vacation, if you will.
Sure.
And it was really challenging at certain
Mhm.
times because like
Right.
there was so much identity built around like this is how I do things and this is how
Right.
I react to things. And like I found that not being so like driven and so like critical of myself was really challenging for a while, and it's still
Yeah.
kind of a balance sometimes of like, oh,
Sure.
okay, we've changed your job description and we're still figuring out how you fit.
Uh-huh. Yeah. Well, that's a good point. That's like a component of IFS where it's like I've heard some people say like, yeah, they can work with their critic and ask it for a different job, and sometimes that works. For most people, it doesn't. It's
Hmm.
like telling, because you have to look at it like these parts feel like if I don't do this job, it's going to be life or death for you. And
Right.
so you asking them, hey, can you take a different job? If that works, great. But for most people, that it doesn't work, right? You actually have to address and understand why this part is doing what it's doing. So how that would look would be if, and I'm not using you as an example, but let's say I'm working with an inner critic and I've built a connection with it. I'm curious about it. I'm open to it. I'm not trying to change it. I may ask a question like, what are you afraid would happen if you didn't beat me up like this, right? And listen for the answer. And it may say, let's just go with the example that you gave of like, well, my identity is built into me doing this, right?
Yeah.
Then you can ask it, like, are you afraid of losing your job if you didn't do this, right? Which some parts are. They're like, what would I do then, right?
Hmm.
And in which case you can offer hope of like, okay. And you may ask, like, what would happen if you lose your job? What would you feel, right? It might lead you towards understanding more, but we can offer the parts like you actually can continue doing what you're doing. You just have more choice in it, right? You would get to choose what you'd want to do. Um, and parts normally can then like, oh, okay, like, so you're telling me I wouldn't have to beat you up because you would have helped with whatever I'm trying to get you to do. For most critics, like them shaming is actually an attempt to help with shame. It's like we feel shame, and then the way to address shame is to shame us so that we don't feel the shame, right?
Yeah.
But in a weird way, it's like these parts are like, oh, you can handle my shame that I'm giving you. You won't be able to handle the shame that I'm protecting you from, right?
Mm.
And
Yeah.
so to ask that part, like, well, just trust me, I can do that, like I can handle that shame, is a big ask. But once they feel connection from us, then they can soften and we can help with whatever's underneath. I found that, and everybody's different, so I don't want to say like if it worked for you, then great. But I found that once you address what they're concerned about, if they didn't do their job, they're
Yeah.
more likely to then be okay with taking a new job. Like
Yeah.
if so just to hone in on your point of like why it may be difficult, it's asking, um, a lot to ask a part to not do their job because if you think about it, well, if they stop doing their job, then all this would take over, right? And they don't want to do that. So um, that could be why, sometimes it can feel hard to just be like, hey, why don't you just take another job? um, so yeah,
Yeah, that's been my experience is like that process was more of really being curious and exploring, well, what are those things that feel unsafe about doing things a different way, or
right,
letting
right,
that inner critic not be so involved in my life.
sure,
And
sure,
like you mentioned, and I think it's so key to having compassion for ourselves and these different parts is like, to that part, the thing that it's protecting you from is life or death sometimes,
right,
and there's a
right,
real sense of urgency and sense of this is not safe to do something different. And
right,
so some of that has been like for me has been exploring, okay, like you said, well, what would happen, and what do I believe would happen if I wasn't so hard on myself, wasn't so critical, wasn't so driven. And then the second part of that to me is like taking it in these like microscopic doses of like, well, okay, I'm going to take one step in the other direction. I'm going to take like
sure,
a healthy amount of stress, and I'm just going to like let the inner critic know like this is okay, we're actually safe, and even though it's uncomfortable and like this doesn't feel right, not so
hmm,
much that my system gets overwhelmed, but like,
sure,
okay, I can handle this little bit of it, and then
right,
a little bit more after I've kind of integrated that, and it just
right,
continues to like to grow, and I also can through that process continue to see these reasons that part is there in the first place, like these
right,
reasons where it's like, oh, okay, this happened when I was a kid and this is the way that it was, therefore it didn't feel safe for me to do X, you
sure,
know so
right,
yeah.
absolutely.
Awesome. Well, Justin, this has been a really great conversation. I really appreciate your time and your flexibility with your schedule. And thanks to everybody that joined the live. Like this has been a like lively audience coming in and out. So I appreciate that as well. Where should people go to learn more about your work and if they want to connect with you?
Sure. Yeah, you can just Instagram is probably the place I put the most content out on. It's you mentioned it before. It's parts of me therapy. My website's on there, so if you want to, reach me, you can shoot me an email or reach out in that way. But that's the best way to find me. And yeah, I really appreciate the time too. I love the conversation, and so thankful too for the work that you're doing um, bringing people together to talk more about this stuff because it's definitely needed, So,
I hope you enjoyed this episode, and if you did, I'd love it if you leave a review. Follow me on Instagram at Blue Magic Alchemy if you'd like to learn more about transformation, integration, and how to connect through coaching, breathwork, and meditation. Remember that regardless of the methods you're practicing, the vital point is to practice.